Good morning, everybody, and happy Gers Day, I suppose we should be saying. It is that time of the year again. The figures have been published this morning, and I'm here with Professor Richard Murphy to answer some of your questions about them. Basically, before we start, Richard, could you just run us through some of your credentials when it comes to looking at these figures?
Well, in terms of these figures, I've been looking at them since 2014. Why have I looked at them? I'm a political economist. I'm a chartered accountant. I was professor of political economy at City University of London for 5 years. Now I'm professor of accounting practice at the University of Sheffield. Actually, the work I do didn't change very much between the two. The point is that I'm really interested in how governments present data to people in meaningful ways. And I engage with government quite a bit, including the Office for National Statistics. And I've engaged on Gers, for which I've become, surprisingly well known for a guy who clearly isn't Scottish in Scotland. And why did I do that? Because I looked at Gers and just thought, well, this is complete nonsense. I did actually make up this term crap, completely rubbish approximation to the truth, to describe Gers, but I've used it since with my students who seem to find it quite funny for all sorts of reasons. But the point about it is that Gers just is lousy accounting. And that's what worries me. We're talking about a report here that is used to bash the idea of an independent Scotland, which I believe in. Bluntly, I think Scotland is a completely credible country that can be independent and could afford to be so, just as other mid-sized countries in Europe are. Let's be honest, that's what Scotland would be in these terms. And so I'm just bored by hearing this argument, which I think is a false representation of data. That's why I got involved with Gers and have been ever since I started in 2014.
Okay, fantastic. So the figures that we've had published this morning show, well, probably what we all expected. Scotland has a deficit. I don't think we were really expecting anything else. It said that Scotland had raised 11 billion more tax income than the previous year, which maybe is unexpected coming out of the COVID pandemic, for a total of 73.8 billion pounds. Now, it also says that the total public spending in Scotland, sorry, I'm having to look at my notes here, I can't remember all these numbers, was 97.5 billion pounds. So that creates a gap, a deficit of 23.7 billion. But the UK government announced in October 2021 that they were going to be handing a record 41 billion pounds a year to the Scottish government in order to run devolved expenditure. So that actually leaves a 32.8 billion pound gap between the funding that the Scottish government have at their disposal and the tax revenues raised in Scotland. Is that right, Richard?
Broadly speaking, but remember, the Scottish government doesn't raise all the funding in Scotland, and Gers is not designed to represent the activities of the Scottish government. So even that comparison is misleading. In fact, Gers doesn't represent any known entity that exists anywhere in the world, let alone in Scotland. I mean, there is nothing else that I've ever seen in accounting for governments anywhere in the world that is like Gers, where we make up a place which is called Scotland, but which isn't Scotland, and which is given costs which aren't incurred in Scotland, but is restricted to being said to have revenues that are only those raised in Scotland. This is make-believe accounting that exists solely in the context of the Scottish debate and literally nowhere else in the world. Not even anywhere else in the UK has something like this. There's no equivalent statement like a WERS for Wales or a NIRS for Northern Ireland. There isn't something like this. This is just made up for Scotland. And so, making this comparison between the Scottish government and Gers is virtually impossible because the Scottish government balances its books. It has to, legally. And as Kate Forbes has said, that's her plan for this year, although we all know there's a couple of billion quid where she might be in or out of range at present because of the risks that are to come. But eventually that's what Scotland, the Scottish government, has to do. So take all of these numbers with a complete pinch of salt. They are not about Scotland.
So, one question that was coming up time and time again, because before Richard came on this stream with us this morning, we asked people across Facebook, across our website, across Twitter for some questions. One question that came up time and time again, I'm going to use the words of an e-viner here, but a lot of people were asking why the Scottish Government publishes it on Scottish Government-headed paper. Why do they give their kind of tacit approval to these figures?
I wish I knew the answer to that. And indeed, I mean, for those who are readers of The National, and I suspect most people watching will be, I've got an article in the National newspaper and on the website today asking that very question, because I thought it was the most important question of the day. After all the time I've looked at this, I can't answer that question. Why does the Scottish Government publish something which seems like a gift to the Unionists? Remember, this was made up by the Tories in 1992, and it was revised, admittedly, under Labour after the turn of the century. But it was always designed to show that Scotland could not be an independent country. That was the intention of this. It is a Unionist document designed to show on different bases the income of Scotland and the expenditure for Scotland. Let me just be clear what that means. The income of Scotland is the taxes raised in Scotland, but the expenditure side of this account is expenditure for Scotland. And in fact, as this Gers document shows, over 30 billion of the spending included in Gers is in fact not spent in Scotland at all. Let's just be clear about that. If the tax paid on that 30 billion of expenditure for Scotland was actually credited to Scotland in this, the deficit would reduce by well over 10 billion. In other words, the deficit would be pretty much consistent with the rest of the UK by making that one necessary adjustment in its own right. But the Scottish Government doesn't insist on doing that. And I am completely bemused. As I said in my article in The National, I sincerely hope this is the last Gers. There are sensible adjustments to make to allow for tax which is owing on money that flows out of Scotland, to take credit for tax paid on money that is spent for Scotland, which should be reflected in Gers, and which would fundamentally change the view of this representation. So either next year's Gers, which should be published 2 months in advance of an independence referendum, we hope, or which will in any case be part of that debate, should either be revised or, frankly, this whole exercise should be scrapped. This is an English agenda imposed on Scotland using data prepared by the Office for National Statistics, who are intensely pro-UK government. That's their job to be so, after all. And why we end up with this, I don't know.
So, that's fantastic. Thank you. So, a question that I'm seeing coming in now and everywhere, really. I'm going to use the words of Alistair Galloway here, but another one that we've seen time and time again. Kate Forbes in 2021 promised that there would be this pro-independence Gers forthcoming. She said after the COVID pandemic, whether or not we're out of that, we can debate. But what alternatives could there be? How could the Gers be reformed to more accurately reflect Scotland's finances?
Well, we could build a model, and I could easily build a model if I had access to the data and some people, because this would take a bit of effort and time, to actually build a better model of what this should look like. I mean, we clearly do know more about Scottish taxation revenues now because Revenue Scotland exists. But let's use some examples where we don't know much. We don't know how much VAT is really paid in Scotland. We definitely do not know how much corporation tax is attributable to Scotland. We do, although it is said that this is estimated on a company by company basis, according to the Gers methodology that I've read this morning. That is nonsense. It isn't. This is guesswork. And I have a lot of experience in estimating international taxation flows because I was involved in negotiating the entire international settlement on this issue at the OECD in 2015. So I know full well the data does not exist to allocate taxes properly between corporation taxes properly between the UK as a whole and Scotland individually. We do need data on, for example, financial flows out of Scotland. Interest flows in vast amounts out of Scotland and is recorded in South East England. So are rents and so is insurance. Now, it is said that these are adjusted for. I don't believe that, bluntly. I don't think the data is there in the methodology I've seen to do that either. Those would add to the tax revenues credited to Scotland. What also would I want, as I've mentioned already, there is this 30-odd billion spent outside Scotland which is claimed to be for the benefit of Scotland on all sorts of things. For example, on defence, on economic recovery, which we really don't know goes to Scotland at all. Some of it is social security benefits inside Scotland, but we can't be sure of that. I mean, I will be honest, I don't know that the systems are that good to be able to apportion with that degree of accuracy. But what we need to know is that that money spent outside Scotland for Scotland actually has the tax paid on it credited to the Scottish account. So, for example, if somebody gets a pension in Scotland and pays tax on it at the moment, although that's charged to Scotland, the tax paid on that pension is not credited to the Gers account. Now, this is the sort of adjustment we need to make to get a proper perspective. When we got that, if we got that proper perspective, my suspicion is that Gers would actually show a deficit for Scotland roughly equivalent to that for England as a whole. And Scotland could manage that. I don't want it to show Scotland with a surplus. Scotland doesn't need a surplus. Scotland needs a government that's willing to support economic life in Scotland. And that would be true after independence too. But this idea that Scotland runs a deficit twice as big as that of the UK as a whole is nonsense. It is not true, cannot be true. And that's partly because the income is understated and partly because, bluntly, an independent Scotland wouldn't incur all the costs that are being charged against this budget now.
So one question that we're seeing even come up in the comments now from people like Stephen Kelly, and they're moving quite quickly down my screen, but Stephen Kelly, Hamilton, Fife, Colin. I've got one here from Grant Stewart. So if England did have its own Gers figures, is Jerry, or however you might want to pronounce it, what could they be expected to look like?
England look, if we have 4 Gers statements, they would all show that the regions apparently make a deficit, and that England as a whole would have a very odd view. The northeast of England would have a pretty bad Gers. The West Midlands in England would have a pretty bad Gers. Where I live in the east of England would have a pretty bad equivalent of Gers. And the City of London would have the most amazingly positive Gers and the area around it in southeast England. Because what we know is that money floods southeast in England around the city. And that is because all the rents are an enormous part of the UK economy. Vast quantities of those get recorded in southeast England. I know they say they adjust for that. I really don't believe they know for certain how to adjust for that. We know that interest by banks is largely recorded in the southeast of England since the collapse of the Scottish banks, which of course happened at the time of the financial crisis in 2008. I really don't think that's adjusted for. And because it isn't properly adjusted for, the southeast of England looks amazingly prosperous and everywhere else looks to be in a pretty poor place. That's because we have a totally unbalanced UK economy. The great thing about independent is that even though I suspect there would be a revival of a financial services centre in Edinburgh, and I have no problem with that, I think Scotland needs its own financial services centre, but not in the same way as the UK has, it won't dominate the economy. So we could end up with a much better, more balanced economy. And let's also be honest, the UK government is also intensely focused on London. So a lot of expenditure is in London for that reason as well. Well, if we look at what Tim Rideout has made SNP policy, slightly to my surprise, that they passed a motion that the Scottish independent government should actually be decentralised with departments spread around Scotland as a whole, again to spread expenditure, would have a much more balanced Scottish economy. So everything would be more about balance, whereas what we're seeing at present is a whole UK economy that is geared towards servicing the City of London and not towards creating regional balance at all. And the regional mayors know this. You know, they yell and scream and shout about it. Listen to Andy Burnham, Mayor of Manchester. He complains, but listen to the guy, and I forgot, my name's gone completely blank, and I'll remember it in a minute, who's the Tory Mayor of West Midlands. He's not too happy either, because the spending patterns are balanced against all the regions, and London wins. That's one of the things that Scotland needs to be rid of. We'd end up with, so there's no point in saying what is a Gers for England like. We'd actually have to split England into the southeast and the rest to get any true perspective as well. The northeast of England might well, by the way, look worse than Scotland does by some way, but we don't know that for certain.
So another question here from Henry Ferguson is there's again, we're seeing it in the comments. It seems to be quite a lot of concern that the expenditure allocated to Scotland isn't of real benefit north of the border. That's the Westminster spending that gives us this 12 point something% deficit. How much of this expenditure Henry Ferguson asks, is of indirect or doubtful benefit to Scotland? Is there any way of knowing that?
It's very hard to tell, and that was I anticipated that question. And there is a section, it's towards the end of the Gers analysis, quite late in it, which does try to allocate expenditure between the various parts of it. I'm trying to flick to it now. I should have made a screenshot of it probably earlier. But look, 50 odd billion is actually spent directly in Scotland. There's some other adjustments which bring it up to around 60 billion, with another 30 billion then being what is spent by England for Scotland. Now, let's be clear, some of that is social security expenditure, and I don't have a problem with that being argued, although whether the number is quite right, we don't know. Whether the tax on that is right is definitely wrong, almost certainly. What I do question are things like, well, they're wonderful accounting adjustments, which come to 9 billion, which is really bizarre. I mean, allocate out your accounting adjustments. Don't tell us there's 9 billion of accounting adjustments allocated to Scotland, which is just an invitation to say, what the hell does that mean? Because frankly, I don't know, and neither do they. And the explanation I bothered to check this one is pretty bizarre in its own right within the document itself. But they claim that those are allocations within the national accounting system. The defence budget is almost certainly wrong. The interest budget is almost certainly wrong. And anyway, the ONS massively overstates interest costs inside the UK government's accounts now. I won't go into you that's the case.
Yeah, so the defence budget comes up quite often. I'm flicking through my notes trying to find the name of the person that specifically asked it. But why would you say the defence budget is almost certainly wrong?
Well, if I look at an equivalent or equivalent countries to Scotland, and I looked at, say, Ireland, and I looked at, say, the one that's so often brought up, which is Denmark, and said, you know, what do they spend on these budgets? And if we actually look at what the Scottish government spends on this at the moment, and I've got the answer to that, it's 3 million quid. And allocated to Scotland is 2.7 billion pounds at the moment in this particular Gers. Would they run aircraft carriers? No. Would they try to run the scale of intervention in overseas policy that is done by the UK government now? No. Would they run the same form of air defence? No. Would they run a sea defence? Yes, but only for fisheries protection. Quite simply, smaller states don't do that sort of thing. And frankly, probably would be better off as a result, because we know that there's lots of question marks about the effectiveness of UK defence forces anyway. And I think that's an entirely appropriate thing to say. I do think there are real questions about that. Would we spend as much on interest? No. Why wouldn't we spend as much on interest? Because the UK government has got an incredibly expensive, or says it has an incredibly expensive debt profile, which actually, A, I don't think Scotland needs to inherit anyway, and B, actually could be serviced at much lower cost than the ONS claims, but which is dumped onto here. Would there be the same degree of expenditure on some other expensive areas, for example, enterprise and economic development, which we can't actually prove is for the benefit of Scotland, but where 2.3 billion has been allocated from central budgets towards Scotland, when Scotland itself only spends 663 million? I doubt it. So 4 times the amount is spent by Westminster on economic development in Scotland than is actually in Scotland itself. I don't doubt some would be spent in Scotland, but that much, I don't know. And I could keep going on from there. That these are big question marks where Scotland would need to make up its own mind, where at present, I think that, frankly, that 32 billion is very hard to justify. The biggest numbers in it are pensions, and I'm not disputing they'd need to be paid, but tax would also be collected on them. And this cost for interest, which I think the 4.5 billion allocated from the UK, is of dubious quality. So
yeah, John Swinney said this morning that the amount of tax raised in Scotland covers, I'm quoting now, all devolved expenditure as well as all social security spending, devolved and reserved, including state pension provision in Scotland. So presumably he's saying there that Scotland raises enough tax to cover what we would consider the basics.
I agree with John basically on this one. He's right. Within those constraints, the revenue raised is enough. I think the revenue, as I've already said, is understated. So I think there's margins for extra spend as well. But what I am saying is that some of the costs dumped look to me to be, well, odd to say the least.
Yeah, and you're saying that if Scotland were independent, it could make choices to reduce the deficit to a normal level, a manageable level. You're an advocate of having a deficit run by a government.
Let's be clear, the UK as a whole, and therefore Scotland as part of the UK, has run a deficit since 1694. And Scotland has had that share since, therefore, 1707. So let's not worry about deficits. They have actually been for the great benefit of the growth of this country, because what they represent is the government injecting money into the economy to fuel growth faster than the private sector would ever have done, and to support projects which the private sector would never do. So deficits are manageable and normal, and actually are the way that we create Scottish sourced money, which again, whatever the people think of the currency debate, Scotland wants to go back into Europe if it's an independent country, and it can't do that without a Scottish currency. So there has to be a deficit to create the money that Scotland would need. So for all sorts of these reasons, we need a Scottish deficit after independence. But there wouldn't be a deficit of the scale that this implies of over 12%. The 6% which is being claimed here instead for the UK as a whole is much more, I believe, the order of the day, which would be actually reflected in the data if this truly reflected a Scottish set of accounts rather than a fictional set of accounts created in London, effectively, I know signed off, and I'm going to go back again. I don't know why the SNP signed this off. Signed off as if it's for a Scotland that doesn't exist.
So just to quickly answer these, well, Hashbury Stumble probably isn't the real name, but these questions coming in. Which department of government does compile Gers?
Oh, there is a Scottish Statistics Department which does produce this inside the Scottish government. I think it's answerable to the Treasury. I'm not sure.
Yeah, there we go. A couple more questions as well. So this one is my handwriting is bad there. It's from John someone.
Sorry, John.
This is a quote from a BBC report now. It says Scotland's illustrative geographical share of North Sea oil and gas revenue under this Gers was 3.5 billion. I think me and John were both a little confused about this. So does that mean that the 3.5 billion is 8% roughly of North Sea oil and gas revenue? What's happening here?
No, actually, North Sea oil gas revenue is tiny, remember. What this is the share of corporation tax collected as a result, and that is what it is. It's corporation tax, fundamentally. The additional taxes which are earned from the North Sea, because there's a ring-fenced oil regime inside corporation tax, which has collected almost nothing for the last few years, but this year has collected 3.5 billion. In fact, rather oddly, and I don't know how this works, according to the report, Gers, 108% of that has been allocated to Scotland on that basis. Over allocating 108% is very odd. On the population basis, the figure would only be 250 odd million. On the geographic basis, it's apparently 3.5 billion, which is more than the total actually collected, which was 3.2 billion. No, I can't explain that because it seems utterly illogical, but which shows just how crap this data is. But what we're talking about here is the UK's pathetic oil regime, which when compared with Norway is utterly inefficient and could collect vastly more, which a Scottish government could do if it wished to, but at present the UK doesn't want to, and which regime will carry on. So again, totally misleading as to what the situation might be in an independent Scotland, where a different attitude towards the long-term energy needs of Scotland and how to use that for revenue purpose would have to be considered in a very different way.
So we've touched on this slightly, but this one's from Twitter from a David Wannell. He asks, can you offer some clarity on things like whisky duty and where big multinationals operating here in Scotland file their receipts if they receive accurate percentage share? Is it credited to London? What? I think that's a question about corporation tax again.
Okay, look, Whisky, I think quite a lot of attention is given to Whisky in the preparation of Gers, and I suspect that Whisky duties do end up largely being credited to Scotland. So I suspect that number is reasonably correct. So let's put that one aside, because I think they know that that one is going to be subject to a lot of scrutiny. Let's look at a large multinational company. No large multinational company reports a separate set of accounts for Scotland from the rest of the UK. The allocation of profits is therefore pure guesswork. We do not know how much profit is allocated to Scotland and how much is allocated to England. And actually what really happens is that the revenue, say HM Revenue and Customs, say, well, there is 60 billion collected in the UK, and there's 8 to 9% of the people of the UK are in Scotland, so we'll allocate them that share of total taxes. Do we know if that's right or wrong? No. Do we know whether there are distortions in that number? No. This is just estimation and guesswork. Could it be right? Maybe. Could it be wrong? Yes. Let me tell you why it's probably wrong. And that is because in the Scottish tax system, as we know, income tax rates are a little higher than in the rest of the UK. Anybody who wants to try and get out of those, who runs their own company, can form a company. And if they do, they don't pay their taxes to the Scottish government anymore. They pay them to the UK government. The incentive to form companies is bigger in Scotland, actually, than it is in the rest of the UK as a consequence. But we don't know whether there's a sufficient adjustment made for the number of self-employed people running companies in Scotland to allocate the revenue back to the UK, to the Scottish Gers account as a result, or not. And it's just one of those many areas where we just, we know that there are perverse incentives inside the devolution settlement and the way the Scottish tax system works, which mean that Gers is probably nonsensical. How far out is it? Look, I don't know. I mean, I'm going to be quite honest with you. There are limits to what we can know here, because the data's not good enough to answer the question for certain. Clearly, some of the tax revenue is allocated on corporation tax to Scotland. Is it the right proportion? Who knows? So
presumably in an independent Scotland, the government could raise the corporation tax levels as well to reduce deficit.
There's a number of things that the government could do in an independent Scotland. First of all, it could properly regulate companies and stop the massive abuse that takes place through company law, which I think is the biggest single cause of the 10% or so UK overall tax gap. If Scotland regulated companies properly, we could end a lot of tax abuse in Scotland and raise a lot of money. And I could do that single-handedly, write the laws this afternoon, and I could solve that problem, literally. Secondly, we could have proper transfer pricing rules between Scotland and the rest of the UK, Scotland and the rest of the world in place, and make it clear we were going to enforce them, which is an area, again, where I've got some specialism and specialist knowledge, and we could do that, and we could raise revenue too. So do I think that a proper Scottish tax authority, which was actually dedicated to raising tax and which was given sufficient money by the Scottish government to do that, unlike HM Revenue and Customs, who are seriously underfunded to actually collect the taxes owed in the UK as a whole, could transform the basis of the Scottish economy? Yes. In fact, part of the transition to independence, which will be necessary, would be dedicating a lot of time and effort to making sure that Scottish tax authority was up, running and properly in place with adequate funding to collect the money owed to Scotland.
Okay, well, these ones aren't technically from the people that have asked them on Twitter and stuff, but I'm just going to run a couple of things by you. So after the publication of Gers, Douglas Ross, the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, tweeted, "The latest Gers figures hammer home the huge benefits we all get as part of the United Kingdom. Every person in Scotland is £2,184 better off. That's the highest union dividend ever." And then he's published those figures with a nice, well, what do you call it, graphic of a Union Jack, as you might imagine. What would you say to that claim?
Well, as I've already said, this is made up data for Scotland that doesn't exist. It's a fiction of the Tory imagination, fundamentally. It's a fiction of the right-wing imagination that they can actually believe what doesn't exist does exist. This is what Douglas Ross is particularly good at, pretending that, an unreal world is what he believes will happen. There isn't a deficit of that scale in Scotland. how much is there actually a deficit in Scotland, which is broadly equivalent to the deficit in the rest of the UK? Is there a £2,000 subsidy to Scotland? Oh, come on, let's not be stupid and patronising about this, which is what Douglas Ross is being. He's claimed that Scotland is too poor to be independent and at the same time is desperate to keep it. You can't hold those two ideas in your mind simultaneously. Either you want to be rid of Scotland because it's a burden on the exchequer in England, in which case get rid of it, or you want Scotland because actually you know that in reality it's contributing a great deal to the overall wealth of the UK. Douglas Ross only exists in a world where he thinks about money. I don't believe he thinks there's a deficit which is a union dividend for Scotland. I think he thinks Scotland is part of the UK because it's contributing enormously to the overall well-being of the UK as a whole, which should belong to Scotland in its own right. And I therefore think he's talking complete and utter nonsense.
Hardly surprised.
Without being rude.
I'm causing all kinds of trouble here. Sorry, one final one then. This one is Kevin Haig, the chairman of the
dear old Kevin, who banned me on Twitter and everything else.
Yeah, he says that he summed up Gers in 2 tweets, but I would venture that the second tweet is unnecessary. So he thinks he summed up Gers in 1 tweet. He writes, Scotland's 8.1% of the UK's population generates 8.0% of tax revenues, but benefits from 9.2% of public sector expenditure. That's his summing up of Gers. How would you say that sums it up well?
No, it sums up Gers incredibly well, yes. It's precisely what Gers says, but as I've said, Gers is nonsense. It includes expenditure which we have no idea is for Scotland, and it excludes income which should be attributed to Scotland. Scotland might actually have more tax revenue by some way than this suggests, in my estimation. Put those two factors together, understated income and overstated expenditure, and you'll come up with a proper set of accounts for an independent Scotland, which would still show a deficit, but nothing like the one that is claimed by the likes of Kevin and the likes of Douglas Ross. And instead, we'd actually have a true and fair view of the future of Scotland, which is of a country more than capable of managing its own affairs with a deficit that it could manage. And instead of that, we get this patronising view from Douglas Ross and from Kevin, which is that, Scotland is incapable of managing its affairs, and every poor person in Scotland needs a subsidy from those rich people of England, and they should be terribly grateful and doff their hats to London as a result. Sorry, but I really think they are out of touch with the mood in Scotland as I read it.
Okay, fantastic. Well, we're not going to keep you tied to your laptop all day, Richard. So we'll let you go there. But thank you so much.
That's fine.
For talking to us. It's been really enlightening. And just in reply to Gavin Hutton here, yes, this video it's not going to be deleted. It should be saved anyway on YouTube, on Facebook, on Twitter, and you should be able to watch it all back and scan through. And we will be putting a story up on our website, and you should be able to watch it on there as well. So yeah, we'll wrap it up there. And thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in. Thank you, Richard, for joining us. And yeah, happy Gers Day.
Happy Gers Day.